class. But again, Francisco Guevara is an artist and scholar who founded and co-directs Arquetopia, which is an artist residency that has numerous locations. It has had them around the world and a number in Mexico, where he will be speaking to us from. Francisco's artwork is an astonishing study of empire, a kind of critique of what are the legacies, the afterlife of empire, and how the afterlife of empire still is at work in art, at work in everyday life, at work in nationalism. His most recent show was this wonderful study about apocalyptic omens and nationalism being one of those apocalyptic omens. Francisco also, for those of you who've already met Dr. Kirsten Buick, Dr. Buick, Kirsten, is also Francisco's mentor, family, friend. And so she, for those of you who have heard her speak in my other classes, will see lots of resonances and connections between the conversations that we've already been having and the conversations we will continue to have. So I'm incredibly happy and honored that Francisco is willing to talk with us about his essay. So I will turn it over to him now.
Well, first of all, thank you for this wonderful invitation. It's always a pleasure to connect, to share ideas. I prepared this lecture or this presentation more than lecture, thinking about what is missing from the essay that I wrote several years ago, and also considering some of the questions that Eva sent me and made me think about, which I always love that process. I'm going to share my screen, and as you heard in the audio, we are actually recording this session. If you don't want to be seen, it's okay. You can also open your microphone and ask a question, or if you want to turn on your camera, you can also do that. I always think of these spaces as spaces for dialogue. So whenever you have a question in the process of the presentation, feel free just to interrupt. I'm not very good with all these technologies, so just open your mic and feel free to ask the question. And so we'll begin. So thank you, Eva, again. It's wonderful to connect with your class and to share these ideas and to spend some time thinking about the huge problems of the world and what we can do from our own corner in many ways, reconnecting. So the title for, well, also you will see my email in the upper part of the screen. If you have any questions before or after, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to respond and connect. So the title is Class Like Phlogiston is a Mistake. And I use this idea of phlogiston as an analogy that Jean-Paul Sartre once used when reflecting on outdated scientific concepts. And phlogiston was a hypothetical substance believed in the 17th and 18th centuries to cause combustion. Scientists thought everything that could burn contained phlogiston, which was released in fire. Once oxygen was discovered, the phlogiston theory was revealed as false, a mistaken framework that had nevertheless organized how people understood the material world for more than a century. And Sartre invoked phlogiston to describe how certain philosophical categories can persist even after their conceptual foundation have collapsed. And I found this in an essay referring to race, so I'm also connecting it to class. And class is a kind of phlogiston, a concept that continues to shape political and cultural discourses, even though its original analytic power as a material relation rooted in labor and ownership has been displaced or obscured by ideology. And I want to show you a little bit of Arquetopia. This is the space, our headquarters in Puebla. We have another space in Oaxaca and also in Cusco. We started as an artist residency, and now we think of ourselves as the anti-residencies. Residencies are actually a branch of colonialism. They started in the 16th century, and to think that Arquetopia would be exempt from these historical relationship would be ridiculous. As Kristen Buick says, we are bound and implicated by the questions we ask. So now we think of it as a space that is flexible, open, fluid, always engaging in anti-colonial ways of seeing. And, this is the purpose of this conversation today. So as Eva shared with you in the essay, it's an interesting essay because of the behind the curtain elements of it. It was an essay that made the editor of the book very uncomfortable, which I find always wonderful as part of the process. And if you remember, there's an anecdote there that is actually mentioning Arquetopia. So I'm going to read that quote, and I'm also going to connect it with another two quotes to frame the presentation today. And it reads, I know that at least in the US, everybody thinks all Spanish speaking people are Mexican, you know? You can't imagine how many times I've been told I'm Mexican, and I'm like, no offense to my Mexican friends, but I'm afraid I'm not Mexican. I'm Central American. I come from a whole different history, politics. It's not the same thing. No, no, no. And this is from a guest scholar that we have in our summer program in 2016. And I included that anecdote in the essay to think about the question of class. And then the other quote is by Frida Kahlo, and it's found in a letter she wrote to Nicholas Murray in 1939. And now it reads, now Breton wants to exhibit together with my paintings lots of popular objects which he bought in the markets of Mexico. All this junk, you can beat that. You have no idea the kind of bitches these people are. They make me vomit. They sit for hours in the cafes warming their precious behinds and talk endlessly about culture in quotes, art in quotes, and revolution in quotes, thinking themselves the gods of the world. And this is again by Frida Kahlo. And we have to think about what Adorno writes: the capacity of representation is the measure of domination. When thinking about class, I want to introduce this piece, The Halls of Moctezuma by Joshua Ocon, which is a contemporary Mexican artist, pretty famous in Mexico, but also in the United States. And in 2014, Oracle, Arizona was the arena for the largest protest against the entrance of unaccompanied children from Central America into the United States. That same year, close to 60,000 unaccompanied children crossed the border. And for this piece, Ocon worked with 9 of these undocumented immigrant children from Guatemala and created a course in which they sing a modified version of the U.S. Marines hymn. The original hymn glorifies, which is the title, the Halls of Montezuma, and the original hymn glorifies U.S. invasion around the world, including Mexico, of course, hence the reference to the Aztec Emperor Montezuma. In the new version of Ocon, the children narrated the U.S. invasion of their home country, placing special emphasis on the complicity of transnational corporations. The title of the piece, refers to what American soldiers chanted as they entered Chapultepec Castle during the invasion of Mexico in 1847. In his work, Ocon uses the bodies of Guatemalan children to spatialize race, turning them into Mexicans. This work has been exhibited both in Mexico and the United States. And with this idea of how we use current events in our work and in our discussions, we need to think about mobility. And this is what the essay, Performing the Fantasy of Mobility, is about. The way we move through space determines how we are ascribed to specific forms of representation. And at the same time, the way we are represented and perceived determines the forms in which we can move, which is what we call body. I will address that also as part of the presentation. Because representations are also the product of historical ideological legacies, these are enabled by the explicit and implicit understandings of race, class, gender, etc., according to a specific space and time in history. Mobility and racialization operate together, especially in places where imperialism form their societies, which is most places in the world. And George Lipsitz explains that race is produced by space, since place is necessary for racism to occur. And the relation between races are at the same time relations between places. Remember, there's a difference between space and place. Space is a relationship, and place claims to be that relationship, but it's actually mapped and controlled. And this is why racism happens in place. Ideologies of scientific racism and imperialism became part of the popular culture in the 19th and 20th centuries, allowing the continuity of colonization through migrations both in the countries of origin and diasporas in the new homelands. Mixed groups with diverse ethnic origins, such as Mexicans or Puerto Ricans, are often racialized to tightly fit them into carefully constructed social grids. Even European ethnic immigrants who were moving west of the United States in the early 19th century were racialized as white, allowing them to invade previously occupied territories and exterminate both Native Americans and also Mexicans. And here we see the 2019 caravan that was moving from Central America through Mexico, trying to get into the United States. And thousands of people from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador formed caravans to flee the violence, poverty, and instability produced by more than a century of U.S. intervention in Central America. US-backed coups, military training, and economic exploitation had dismantled local democracies, privatized land, and fueled organized crime. Traveling together became the only way for many to move safely across Mexico towards the very country whose policies had forced them to migrate. Families, children, and the young people walked for weeks under extreme conditions, facing hunger, exhaustion, and abuse. This caravan revealed not only the collapse of regional infrastructures, but also the direct consequences of US foreign policy, from Cold War counterinsurgency to neoliberal trade agreements and extractive industry that destroyed local economies and environments. For the US government, the caravans were portrayed as a border crisis. For the migrants, they were the human cost of and for the migrants were they were the human cost of empire, an act of collective resistance against the same power that shaped their displacement. Their journey was a demand for recognition, dignity, and accountability. And when that event was happening, we started to see these kinds of discourses and narratives in mass media. And today, mobility continues to have different impacts on the experiences of its practice. For instance, these asylum seekers were Mexicanized through their mobility by the US, while Europeans are self-racialized through their endless mobility and the tightly security of the EU borders against any non-European. This is also from the essay. In quotes, whiteness can only dissolve its multiple ethnicities by racializing everyone else. Over the years, the contention at borders has popularized a fear expressed in representations such as immigrants, criminals, prostitutes, and wage-cutting labor. All of these are forms of discourses, not people. Ideologies create and maintain the conditions of oppression. In quotes, racism creates and maintains race, sexism creates and maintains gender, as well as nationalism maintains the nation. And what we see here is how, more than a funny quote or a representation of ignorance, and let's keep in mind that ignorance is a cultural production. It's the way in which we racialize and we assign meaning to the invention of body. And this is why mobility produces that effect because we assign these values as people have to move. So it reads Trump cuts US aid to 3 Mexican countries. And rather than really, thinking about and explaining the context of the problem, the other side of the spectrum politically was criticizing this in terms of ignorance rather than understanding the US intervention in these specific regions and how it created that amount of violence. So from there, we think about the notion of West. And this is West, Western, Westernize. And these are imaginary centers that we should never acknowledge. We should never concede to the center as they don't exist. So sociologist Ramon Grossfogel states that West, in quotes, including Western, is no longer a geographical region, but a position in power relations. It is an ideological construction that enacts one of the most perverse silences in the history of humanity. In the elusive meaning of West, in quotes, a silence is implicit. It is in the process of ambivalence that colonial discourses and their close ties to domination and extermination continue to be relevant. Kirsten Buick explains how the West, in quotes, is the ideological culmination of everything horrific that has happened in the world. Everything awful thing, every awful thing that it has done to people and groups of people. When using Western as a euphemism of European, it subsumes all other internal voices raised in protests such as indigenous and black. So here we land in how hate takes place. This is from Audre Lorde. Racism, the belief in the inherent superiority of one race over all others and thereby the right to dominance, manifest and implied. And here I add an expansion of classism, the feeling, because it's also rooted in domesticity, produced by the belief or inherent superiority over all races, geographies, species, and all beings, and thereby becoming the right to project our hate and ignorance over any form of life, prioritizing a moral and capital gain. And from there, we need to think about class as an ideology of ascriptive difference. Class, just like race, is a taxonomy of ascriptive difference. That is an ideology that constructs populations as groups and sorts them into hierarchies of capacity, civic worth, and desert based on natural or essential characteristics attributed to them. Ideologies of ascriptive difference help to stabilize a social order by legitimizing its hierarchies of wealth, power, and privilege, including its social division of labor as a natural order of things. Ascriptive ideologies are just so stories with the potential to become self-fulfilling prophecies. They emerge from self-interested common sense as folk knowledge. They are known, in quotes, to be true unreflectively because they seem to comport with the evidence of quotidian experience. They are likely to become generally assumed as self-evident truth and imposed as such by law and custom when they coverage with reinforcement the interests of powerful strata in the society. And that means that we need to think about what class is actually doing as much as what race is actually doing through the centuries, and we're going to use these ideas to explain a little bit of Latin America and specifically of Mexico. So through the centuries, class in Latin America, with its many processes of identification and social negotiation, has become the most important signifier. Its roots could be traced in history, the concepts of limpieza de sangre or purity of blood, and the complex lexicon developed, including casta, race slash caste, calidad, quality, and clase, class, eventually evolving into contemporary class systems. And although limpieza de sangre started as a religious concept, it eventually led to the notion of citizenship that we have today. As the notion of self was contingent to these concepts, reproducing and disrupting power happened simultaneously. On one hand, this process was a sociopolitical contestation and cultural negotiation to resist racialization by Europeans, and on the other, it became a very effective system of exclusion, domination, and oppression. Such entanglement between race and class still prevails in Latin America, and although these processes of identification function very differently from modern racial ideologies, they reproduce similar systems of power and coercion through forms of representation, including mobility. So here we have a very specific genre of painting that actually developed in the 18th century in Mexico, which is called casta paintings. And casta paintings are usually interpreted as a genre of art with an apparent contradiction, celebrating racial mixing while at the same time asserting the legitimacy of racial hierarchy. However, when we take into account the long-lasting tradition of spatialization, both from the Americas and the European continent, the technology is more visible. Casta paintings include references to landscape and domestic scenes, reinforcing the specialization of class. This genre of painting will also eventually become a representation of the ideas of freedom, the crystallization of nationalism, and the consolidation of gender roles. And when I was thinking about this presentation and I sent the essay performing the fantasy of mobility, Ava asked me a question about the border that I think that I thought of this morning in terms of body. I think one of the most perverse inventions of empire has been body. So I added a few slides just to explain a little bit as an introduction, because eventually we'll also use these ideas in the next session, thinking about Audre Lorde's work, so that we can begin expanding and rethinking what body is, a body is actually doing, the notion of body, which is a Cartesian invention, imperial, etc. So here I introduce three little points, and the body is not itself, it is a battleground. It is subject to control through the legacy of the Renaissance, colonialism, and imperialism. The, in quotes, perfect body is now under siege by the pharmaceutical, aerobic, dietetic, liposuctive, and calorie control cybernetic world of empire. The body has become a central concern both in academia and the wider culture, providing one of the few points of direct contact between these often divorced spheres. These are some of the ideas from the book Bodyscape by Nicholas Mirza. The body is mutable, incomplete, and always in flux. In quotes, this alarming feeling of instability has led to numerous efforts to control the development of the physical body by promoting certain physical characteristics at the expense of others. And this is also connected to the notion of freedom, as you remember from the essay. We experience freedom always at the expense of very specific targeted groups or actually individuals. The body is at once the final point of resistance to the global imperatives of empire and the first to be affected by it. So rather than thinking it as a thing, as an object, we need to think of it as a point of resistance. It is our last point of resistance against the imperatives of empire. It is also the first to feel it, to experience it, and it's also to begin relinking, reaccepting the links between body and mind, which were never actually severed. And this is from Alfredo Lopez Austin. The font is a little bit small, but because we're recording this, I will also make this available for you guys so that you can actually read it, but I'll read it for you. So Alfredo Lopez Austin, and he's a very, very important scholar in the practice of Arquetopia, because he is the voice that I have found that explains in better wording why body is an invention. And he explains that the modern notions of body, and by modern we have to think about modernity, not current only, but actually modernity. Modern means to exist in time and also to exist in time in terms of profit. And the project of modernity is crafted in the 16th century. So that's why I'm using the term Modern did not exist, body did not exist in pre-Hispanic Mesoamerica. He explains that the Nahua worldview did not separate mind, body, and spirit as distinct entities. Instead, the human being was understood as a system of forces or anemic essences in constant exchange with the cosmos, a dynamic rather than a bounded form. This is why Lopez Austin insists that translating terms such as Ixitla, and what we are going to see in the next slide is in the early moments of the project of modernity, religious orders mistranslated on purpose many of these terms, and I'll explain why. And Ixitla is one of them. Ixitla, as translated as body or representation, is misleading. In Nahuatl, Ixitla referred not simply to a physical vessel, but to the embodiment or actualization of a sacred force in a particular form, whether a person, an idol, or a ritual substitute. The Shiptla was not an imitation, but a manifestation of divine presence. And that's the first discrepancy that we see with the ideas of Renaissance. Renaissance invents that the concept is separated from the medium, while in Mesoamerica, form, concept, and material were not separated, and therefore they become manifestations of divinity. For instance, feathers are one of the examples. And eventually I can also show you some of the work that I've made in relation to that when we have some time. So the Shipla was not an imitation, but a manifestation of divine presence, temporarily inhabited by the sacred essence it represented or is actually manifesting. Therefore, in the Mesoamerican world, there was no body as an isolated biological object. The human being was porous, and actually, human didn't exist until the 16th century. It was relational and cosmological, a node in a web of energies connecting gods, ancestors, animals, and elements. For Lopez Austin, imposing the European concept of body, in quotes, onto this system distorts indigenous epistemologies, which understood existence through flows and transformations rather than containment. And here we see one of the first convents established in the Americas, which is in Huejotzingo, here, Puebla, very near where Arquetopia is actually located. And the image is representing the 12 Franciscans that arrived, mimicking 12 apostles. And this is an idea from the first paragraph is an idea from Nicholas Mirsov. In the standard settler colonial legal phrasing, and this is very important to keep in mind, adverse possession means taking land without the consent of those who were already there and thereby acquiring title to that land. And in Mexico, we have to think of Christopher Columbus around October 12th, so this is very pertinent. It remains an active and central part of US law, but also international law in general. Such taking possession without consent is equally applicable to bodily violations of all kinds. Since the 16th century, Europeans have visualized colonialism as rape. And if we research a little bit, for instance, the name Europe is the story of rape. And if you research a little bit the images and allegories of America as a woman, it's also a story of rape. So that's why colonialism and rape are inseparable, because they turn the body into a thing that can actually be subject to dominion. So in this context, the invention of the body was inseparable from the theological and legal frameworks that justified possession of land, of labor, and of life itself. Within Franciscan ideology, the body became a new frontier of colonization, a site to be disciplined, purified, and owned just as territories were. The Franciscans who arrived in New Spain in the early 16th century saw conversion not merely as a matter of faith, but as the reconstruction of the person to strip indigenous peoples of their previous ways of being and rephrasing them into Christian subjects. They sought to amend a relational logic by imposing a bounded discipline body, one that could confess, labor, and obey. The body became both the metaphor and the terrain of conquest, its boundaries enforced through the language of sin, purity, and salvation. And here we come back to the notion of casta paintings. And I want to present a few examples to understand how body appear in space specifically, or in place, from space being distorted into place, from the perspective of nationalism in Mexico. And here I'm using Benedict Anderson ideas from Imagined Communities. Census, map, and museum are three institutions of power that change their form and function as the colonized zones enter the age of mechanical reproduction, profoundly shaping the way in which the colonial state imagined its dominion. And in that sense, the nature of human beings ruled became the census, the geography of its domain became maps, and the legitimacy of its ancestry became museums. And we see all of these in these specific paintings. The nature of human beings is how these domestic scenes invent the notion of family, but also individuals, but also class, but also race, but also gender, etc. The geography of its dominion are the actual maps that are included. You can see on the upper part of the image, on the left, Mexico City, on the right, the port of Acapulco, which is where all the um, merchandise was coming from Asia. And also the legitimacy of its ancestry becomes art. So this specific painting situated in a museum. And as we weave these notions, we are including the views of these artists who actually crafted the notion of nationalism, which are, of course, Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. And one of the racist classist quotes that he also wrote was, "Only Indians, gente de calzón blanco," which is kind of garment, "go to the National Museum with their hearts full of devotion and lively sensibility." And think about how we are becoming complicit in these kinds of images. These images not actually from Diego Rivera, is from Picturesque Mexico, Artistic and Monumental by Manuel Rivera Cambas, which is the kinds of works that were produced in the 19th century. And here you can see a couple, of course, attired as Europeans, looking at an Indio, in quote, an indigenous person, having these mesmerizing experience by looking at ancient monoliths, or this idea of art. And this is what Diego Rivera was actually referring to. So using that same notion, I'm going to show some images of the Anthropology Museum, the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. So we have to think about how Mexico has been the object of imperialist fantasies since Hernán Cortés effected the Spanish conquest in the early 16th century. Cortés' rhetorical domestication of the landscape redirected Spanish aspirations from the commerce to colonization and transformed the strange New World into New Spain, a rational extension of the old. And think about how it's always about aspirations of commerce, aspirations of property, adverse possession. And this is an image that I took inside the Museum of Anthropology, and we see maps, modern art. I wrote an essay on how the collection of modern art in the museum seems to be invisible, although it's one of the largest and most important collections that exist in Mexico, and also these pre-Hispanic pieces and in relation to the visitors. So we need to think about how the visitor becomes a body and how the museum becomes Mexico. So here we see the geography of its domain. It's again maps, how these maps are being enacted as a way of referencing and also situating. Then we see the nature of human beings ruled, meaning how these images of modern art situate notions of identity, and then also the legitimacy of ancestry, how the actual museum is constructed as a narrative that makes you transit through these ideas, eventually situating who is a native person, who is indigenous, who is mestizo, who is of a certain class, and even who is tourists. So from there, we introduce specialization. And specialization is the spatial forms that social activities and material things, phenomena, or processes take on. In his book, How Racism Takes Place, George Lipsitz explains how racial ideology, being a distortion, is place bound. In quotes, the lived experiences of race takes place in the actual spaces, while the lived experiences of place draws its determined logic from overt and covert understanding of race. End of quote. To further expand, class notions function similarly through the geographic specialization of bodies. Class determines the places people inhabit. It is not a choice. Because of practices that socially classifies bodies through space, class is spatialized and it is learned, legitimated, and perceived as natural, necessary, and inevitable. Classist imagination takes place through the enactment of history and visual representation, relegating people's bodies to different classes and different places, producing unequal access to education, employment, and transportation, and in general access to resources. And one of the important ideas that seems to also be missing is to understand that class is not really economic status. And therefore, in Mexico, you cannot move from one class to the next. There is a little bit of mobility, but it's not through economic, through wealth or profit that you can actually change classes. You're born within your class and you die within your class. And because it's a system so well structured in terms of empire, we have not even developed language of class. And what we see is that now we're also importing racist language to actually prevent any social change. So we're going to see how this is connected to um, the situation. So specialization of class. Thomas C. Holt stated, in quotes, recognizing the relative plasticity of race and racism as concepts of their parasitic and chameleon-like qualities as practice, I have also suggested that we might do better not to try to define or catalog their content. Rather, our task might be instead to ask what work race does. The role of colonialism, in the quote, the role of colonialism, both internal and external, has culturally codified political and social recognition through the specialization of class in Latin America. Class, as a modern ideology, carries the legacy of limpieza de sangre, casta, calidad, and clase, and just like race, is also parasitic, attaching itself to other forms of ideologies, and chameleonic, changing form continuously. Although classism, and racism are not equivalent, they function in similar ways. Or as Malcolm X expressed, racism is like a Cadillac. They bring out a new model every year, and that happens also with class. And from there, I want to introduce a few ideas about neoliberal aesthetics, in quotes, and this is from Walter Ben Michaels. You definitely know you're in a world that loves neoliberalism when the fact that some people of color are rich and powerful is regarded as a victory for all the people of color who aren't. Neoliberal aesthetics refers to how contemporary culture transformed social inequality into a spectacle of diversity and difference. In other words, what used to be understood as class inequality is now treated as a problem of misrecognition or underrepresentation. In quotes, the commitment to diversity replaces the commitment to equality. End of quote. Art and literature that celebrate, in quotes, voices, identities, and inclusion become politically acceptable precisely because they do not challenge the economic order that produces inequality. Adolf Reed Adolf Reed similarly insists that, in quotes, identity politics has become the ideal ideology for neoliberalism because it does not require challenging the economic structures of capital. As Michaels argues in The Trouble with Diversity, in quotes, we like diversity because we don't like inequality. Neoliberal aesthetics is where moral sentiment replaces political analysis. And think about this wording, moral sentiment, because now we have to think how feelings are not facts. Moral sentiment replaces political analysis. Works of art that evoke empathy, awareness, or recognitions are praised as politically radical, when in fact they depoliticize material injustice. The aesthetics of empathy becomes a moral alibi for the market. Spectators feel ethical simply by seeing, acknowledging difference. And here we see, of course, Kehinde Wiley's Napoleon leading the army over the Alps. Neoliberal aesthetic is not about the disappearance of politics, but about its absorption into the marketplace. Museums, universities, and cultural institutions reward art that stages identity difference because it allows the system to appear progressive without redistributing power or wealth. The aesthetic logic of neoliberalism, therefore, is inclusionary but not transformative. It replaces the demand for justice with the image of justice. Neoliberal aesthetics is the cultural phase of a political economy that turns critique into commodity. It celebrates diversity as a sign of virtue while maintaining, even deepening, structural inequalities. And this is why museums cannot be decolonized. This is why decolonization belongs to the imaginary. It's an interesting goal, but it's actually what we have to do is learning how to see in an anti-colonial way. And in fact, Emmanuel Levinas explains that the way in which the closed world of art therefore freezes time within images, doubles and immobilizes beings. Characters suffer an eternal anxiety, imprisoned in an inhuman interval. The disengagement this encourages means that art is an evasion of responsibility since it offers consolation rather than a challenge. And he actually refers to art as a dead seed with no future. It is actually trapped and frozen in time with no possibility of change. Art doesn't change anything. If anything, artists have the power to enact change, but frequently they give it away to produce objects which we call art. And then I want to introduce these ideas from Audre Lorde as a segue for the next session and also to have enough time to answer any questions and engage in dialogue. So, interdependence as a political act. Audre Lorde understood class as an ethical and relational structure rather than a purely economic one, a way of organizing value, silence, and privilege. For her, class could not be disentangled from race, gender, or sexuality because all were mechanisms of control that shaped who could speak, create, or survive. She exposed how capitalist hierarchies divide people by assigning worth to certain forms of labor and knowledge while rendering others invisible, writing that, in quotes, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live in single issue lives, end of quote. For her, teaching, parenting, healing, and creating were acts of class resistance, which I found really powerful. Forms of generosity that challenge systems of accumulation. As she affirmed, in quotes, caring for myself is not self indulgence, it is self preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. Now, we also have to think about how she expanded this idea in terms of community, because it's not the selfish I caring for myself, only for myself, but rather what Donna Haraway explains when she says, when we meet, it's not the question who we are, but who do we want to become together. So, in this sense, class becomes an ethical terrain, an invitation to transform privilege into solidarity and to recognize interdependence as a political act. Art and education are not luxuries, and I would say the act of creating and the act of learning are not luxuries, but urgent tools for unlearning the capitalist myth of separateness and reimagining community as shared responsibility. So from there, we land in the battle. Um, the battle against Lord reminds her readers, everyone, all of us, that the power to reclaim these forces within it's ours for the taking. The battle against U.S. imperialism is a battle against white supremacy. It is also the battle against capitalism, and it is a battle against homophobia, and it is a battle against cancer. She wrote in quotes, "Sometimes we are blessed with being able to choose the time and the arena and the manner of a revolution, but more usually we must do battle where we are standing. The real blessing is to be able to use whoever I am, wherever I am, in concert with as many others as possible." Once more, her words beckon us to remember that interdependency, solidarity, and connection are the only means towards true belonging and survival. Now, as she wrote, in quotes, is a time for the real work's urgencies. And I want to stop right there.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. So many important insights, so many continuities with questions we've been thinking about in our course. So I'm hoping that some of you might be willing to share questions with Francisco. And if you're uncomfortable having the camera on, you can speak without the camera on. But also, if you are uncomfortable with that, you can put them in the chat and I will help read them out for you. So, does anyone have any questions? Maybe, yeah, maybe I'll go first. And maybe, oh, Dave, do you want to go first? Okay.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, first of all, thank you. That was fantastic. There's a lot to think about. I mean, there's a lot of lines, I think, to be drawn between various things. And so it's it's difficult to find the sort of core, I think, of all of this, as it always is. But to go back to your essay, um, this is kind of a long question, so I
It's all
apologize.
right. Absolutely, yeah.
So the really short version is, do you feel that access to mobility broadly is mostly given, or do you feel that it's majorly the result of restriction? And to contextualize that, on the last page, or the last paragraph, that is, of page 263 in your essay, you write, as a social and cultural construction, mobility gets unevenly distributed as a resource. Therefore, the fact of movement cannot be referred to as mobility, but as the production of many mobilities. And then in the context of UNM's own Dr. Kirsten Buick, you quote as saying, freedom cannot be given, it can only be taken away. And then in the last paragraph of 10.2 on page 264, you write also, mobility as an idealization of movement is a fetish dependent on the exclusion of others who are positioned as not free in the same way. And so would it be fair to say also, or instead, that mobility is unevenly restricted as a resource, and that the fact of movement cannot be referred to as mobility, but as the result of many restrictions. Is that like a similarly, is that like a fair way to rephrase that, even if it's not a one-to-one concept?
No, because and that's a wonderful question because I had to think about the difference between freedom and being free.
Sure.
And this is why James Baldwin is the one who says freedom cannot be granted, it can only be taken. And Kirsten contextualizes that by letting us understand that we experience freedom always at the expense of others. So what I think, to explain it in a better way, is that we're born free and quickly we are seduced by the notion of freedom. So it's not really that we are restricted, it's that different mobilities are produced with many restrictions, but nothing is absolute in the sense, because saying that we were restricted would acknowledge a center. And it's frequently the question that is being asked. So by artists in the residency, should I not travel? Should I not do this? And it's not a matter of doing or not doing. We are all colonized subjects, and that means we are all in line for extermination. We all become meat for profit. It's a matter of how we sort the order differently. So that's why we need to rethink body as an invention, because it's what produces those effects. And it's not that we have the capacity to control the effects, or just by saying body doesn't exist, they will not produce the effects, but it's through the notion of rhythm that we can learn to interrupt empire.
Sure.
So what I frequently think about is the encounter, as in the way Levinas describes it, the face-to-face encounter, which is a term. Um, it's the only space and time, and think about space and time as relationships that have not been colonized or domesticated yet. Yet. So rather than thinking of place and history, we need to think about space and time. And there's a wonderful essay by Elsa Barkley Brown. It's titled "What Has Happened Here?" And she talks about rhythm, and she specifically refers to um, asymmetrical forms of rhythm. And what we're seeing there is she's challenging the whole legacy of Renaissance, which is all about symmetry. And think about how cities are built in terms of symmetry and temples are built in terms of symmetry. In Mesoamerica, and this is something that in the last probably 8 years I have learned, because we don't get any education in terms of previous cultures that existed. This is frequently ignored. Symmetry didn't was not useful, and it was more about performative and movement. So the pyramids, the temples, the ways in which things were organized were asymmetrical. So Elsa Barkley Brown describes how in jazz, the object, when we think about art, the object in itself is improvisation. And that requires a space in which you engage with different tempos that you have to negotiate, but also engaging with the listeners. And I associate also this with what Mirsov describes in his book White Sight as seeing in the dark, or seeing through opacity. We don't really see each other, we can't. So rather, we need to learn to touch the bare ground with all the extermination that has happened. And as we touch the rubble, we have touched each other. And it's not that by touching you, I can learn who you are, but rather I would have to alter my rhythm to figure out how to move in concert with you. So rather than thinking of mobility and freedom, we think about rhythms in our own tiny spaces in which change can actually happen.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the long and thought out answer to my lengthy question.
Other questions? Clarifications that you have either from the essay or from the talk? I have one, Francisco.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wondered if you could talk a little more about you in the end of your talk, and it shows up earlier when you're talking about art. You're talking about the limits of art, and you advise us to think about the process or the making of art as an important way of complicating how we understand art's potential, art's limits, art's radical imaginary. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about your thoughts regarding art and art process.
Absolutely. First, we have to think about images as screens, and this is also something that Nicholas Mirsov explains. And more than ever, it's visible how screens function. He even refers to examples as the suffragettes stabbing paintings and breaking windows, breaking the screen to be able to see how screens protect property. In the end, every conflict, minor, big, in our lives and in the world, it's always arising because of the protection of property. And art, even if we do it with the best intention, even if we are passionate about it, even if we'll do that, we become a screen. And what screens do is that we project feelings onto them and they feed us. And that creates chemistry that makes us addictive. That's why we're addicted to screens. And the empire's all about addiction in every sense, in every possibility. So when we think about art, frequently is thought as a space of resistance and a space in which we have the best intentions and that we could control intention. And it's not true. Contemporary art, it's framed that way, that we have this idea and we use the form and we use the materials and therefore it conveys this, but it's not true. In fact, our own work will be used against us in many instances. So I use that to understand that art doesn't change anything. And we frequently are seduced by the market. And this is not a conversation about not selling or selling. Each one of us has to deal with empire in different ways, and we can't fully disengage with it. We are all colonized subjects in the end. But it's to separate and emancipate ourselves. It's very similar to the notion of being free and freedom. Emancipate ourselves from the production of objects. The object in the end is absolutely irrelevant. The process is what matters because I have learned through the residency and Arquetopia's method to trust intuition. And that means it's a way of resisting morality and it's a way to bring back notions of ethics into everyday life. So it's a way of moving. And I use the example when we're little and we are first introduced to a dog, we learn there either to move fast or to move really slow or to not move at all. And that can be connected to our practice of teaching, of reading, of writing, of painting, whatever, cooking, whatever it is. It's a way of moving. And in the end, what I think about, because frequently when I not destroy, but in terms of method, I present all these dead ends, then artists are asking me for another option rather than hope. Hope is always a problem because hope doesn't make you do anything, it makes you not move. I hope you feel better doesn't mean that I will do anything to make you feel better. And we frequently confuse action with hope. It's not that hope as a term is wrong or action is better. It's not one or the other. We frequently use hope or action indistinctively, and it's also the problem of language. language is also born dead, but is to understand that that Christianity as an ideology is always requiring the lynching of someone, always. So in that sense, we need to rely on movement. And if Levinas' ideas, they resonate with me, not because I want to sound smart, I don't care about that. It's because I found them practical. And that's why I use his teaching as much as I use Audre Lorde. Only what makes sense to me is what to me should be taught in my perspective, because otherwise, how do you explain something that is not even resonating with your life? So, in that sense, if what Levinas is saying could be true, it should have other ways of interpretation in other fields. And that's what quantum physics explains, that present, past, and future coexist simultaneously. And that means that this moment is existing in eternity, forever, with many different outcomes happening simultaneously. So that gives us back our agency. It's not about voting or not voting, it's not about democracy. It's about how we are willing to change together. And the only way to understand change, we will see also in the next session through Audre Lorde, is rhythm. We need to figure out how to move differently. In the end, the practice of everyone should be about interruption. And the only way to interrupt anything is to move differently, to change violence. It's to interrupt. And that means that we have to begin by maybe waking up on the other side of the bed, or maybe using shoes differently, or maybe drinking coffee differently. Little acts become larger possibilities of resistance. So I focus the practice of making and creating there. It's not really, in many instances, I have to operate as a mirror. And that freaks out artists because I can't control what they will see in the mirror. But frequently, we all bring our monsters into the practice, and seeing them is scary. But once you have seen the monster, you can name the monster. And from there, you can figure out methods. And that's how we rely in different scholars. This one has done this in this way. So we intersect different conversations that interrupts the practice. It's not really about translating theory into making art, is to interrupt it and then follow our intuition, not our intention, not what is expected of us, but rather how do we move? Why do we make this first and this second? And then we'll see how it has a relationship, a long relationship, or a long uh, way in which we have done it in the past as a way of resisting, but also moving, but also engaging. So it's that space in which we emancipate from art to reclaim the practice, which is actually connected to our everyday life.
Thank you so much for that.
Oh, absolutely.
Other questions you might have. Again, you can post them in the chat. Maybe something, a line from Francisco's essay. Hi, Max.
Yeah, actually, I wrote down a note on page 260, and it was just highlighting the word distortions because we were talking a lot about distortions in the master's tools in relation to Audre Lorde. And I was wondering, especially maybe now in the modern AI world, just now kind of popped into my head, how art can sometimes be used by the master as a weapon, as an attempted weapon from them against the masses, especially in modern era with all of the modern intricacies of the world.
Yes, it's not really a question of technology in terms of AI. Art is married to power since the 18th century, and it's always used against us. It's not sometimes, it's always, always. I have, there's many examples, but it's always used against us because we need to understand how images produce sentimental effects that have ideological effects in how we can move or not move. So, as you mentioned, the key is, and this is something Audre Lorde mentions in her essay, the uses of anger. Anger is the product of grief because of distortion among peers. And that's where I draw the connection between the distortion of space. Think about how we are engaged. We're miles away from each other, yet we're in the same space because it's a relationship. But rather we distort that, not necessarily we, but in the world, it becomes place. And place is always mapped and controlled. So distortion is connected to anger. Distortion is, I use three terms: disruption, distortion, interruption. Those three together become a method and a practice. So it's not really that the outcome matters in terms of the object, but rather the process to arrive to any possibility of interruption. So, for instance, in the residency, and that's why I mentioned frequently intuition. It's in many instances when we are in very structured, classical, traditional classes, art classes, the professor will ask you, why did you do this? And it's a gimmicky for this, and in fact, we need to learn reconnect with our intuition. It doesn't mean that it's going to lead to truth, but it's signaling a way of moving that can disrupt something. It's the way we have survived. It's the way we have engaged with others. So we focus on those ways of interrupting. And I use the example, I I explain how art history is being organized. In the 21st and 20th century, concept is imagined as a source of meaning. This is my idea, this is the form, this is what I do, and it produces this effect. But it's not really true. It doesn't happen that way. Um, Context means with text, and that means that an art piece, can be put in any context and it will be read differently depending on the context. But if we look at the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, artists were trying to find different possibilities of abstraction as a way of connecting with with truth, with purity. So that's where color theory emerges. Blue makes you sad and orange makes you hungry. Not true. Circles are universal. Nothing is universal. If anyone claims anything universal, that's already a red flag. Circles are in all cultures, therefore they're universal. No, a pizza and a tortilla, they are based on circles. They do not taste the same. They're very, very different. Mhm. But when we get into the 18th century, when art is actually born, and also art history is born as a discipline, we see that technique is what makes you read, tells you something about the work. It doesn't tell you what it is. So, for instance, we all have a relationship with painting. We all know how to read painting in different ways. We have learned it in different, so there's techniques that we learned. And it's not that there's a correct one and a wrong one, we just have them. Same with prints. Prints are books, prints are maps, prints are, or photos. Even now making photos in scale larger or smaller, we all have an understanding of how to read the work. So if you use the vocabulary of technique, and in reality, to think about the practice, artists have questions. This notion that we have to cast a light on the future of humanity is stupid. We barely understand our journey to try to explain somebody else's. So we're full of questions. So what I suggest is phrase your question by using the vocabulary of the technique, because the technique will force the viewer to move in ways that they have not consented to. Think about if you place an image on the top of the space, people will be forced to look up. Or if you make it small, they will have to engage in a very intimate way. So each technique has its own vocabulary, and through intuition, we have chosen those vocabularies through our practices. There's things that we like that we can't really explain in terms of techniques, in terms of colors, in terms of materials. And that's because it's connected to ways in which we have learned to move, to vibrate, to interrupt, to appear in space. And that can be connected to the question that your work is about. Because in the end, art doesn't change anything, but also artists ask me, if this doesn't change anything, then why do you make art? Because it's the only way I will survive. It's the only way I can engage with this horrible, nasty world. And it's not an escape. You know, I always say the world is absolutely nasty. We are born into this world unwelcome, and we quickly learn that, even if we have wonderful families. But life is a wonderful song worth singing. So, in that sense, the practice is engaging with the song because it's all about rhythm.
Well, thank you so much for that, Francisco, and for this session today. And I'm so glad that we get more time with you on Monday to continue to think through your essay, the provocations you've given us today, and additional provocations that you'll give us on Monday. So thank you so much for being here with us.
Absolutely.
For students, I'll see you on Wednesday. I'll have an updated syllabus that will include Francisco's talk on Monday and the kind of slight changes the insignificant changes to our syllabus. And thank you, Francisco, so much.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them and we can talk about them next week.
Yeah. Yeah, if you didn't ask them now, write them down and have them ready to type in or share with Francisco on Monday, or email him.
Yes, either way. All right. See you Monday. Thank you.